Okay, so I have to get back into the issue of the manner now of the three sections of metaphysical template which I created: the essence, the mode, and the manner. And this is involving a world now where we actually exist, and less possible worlds in general, or the most general fact that there are worlds at all, and it's the source of that fact, which is the pure metaphysics. But we're now into the, as it were, the physics, or the description of the actual world we're in, the manner of the essence and its modes. And the manners relate to the actual details of the existence in which you are. Not just in one form, but in several forms. One form would be, for example, the way that it is. So this is an aspect of the essence remanifesting in the manner that things are, because it's an individuation of that essence. So in this realm where individuation occurs, decisions are made, and time is created as a function of those decisions and their consequences. And so it's a value-laden reality right at the foundation of it. But what happens is that in worlds where there's been a divergence from the proper source or along the way to its consequential effects in an event-ridden world, and then how that world responds to and attempts to account for the need to return to that origin with the fruit of the ratio, creating perfect justice, that question has become one in our actual world of mostly usurpation and inversion, as I described in the last video. So this disrupts the cause of the momentum for the future of that being, and the reasons for the actions taken to create the time and the space where that being plays out its expressions. That is not reconnecting with the origin, and of course it cannot, because it's evil. And that's why it's busy with usurping the emblems of authority and inverting the practices that they conduct with their powers in their offices. That's just one example among many. But to be specific in terms of how it affects and then thereby infinitizes these problems it can create on more basic levels, like devour or be devoured, parasitism, the way that people play game theoretic decisions out on one another in worlds where even coordinated social action doesn't yet exist, let alone technology of this sort. All those patterns are already invested in nature as the fundamental forms of evil. But moving on to the way that it could be infinitized or maximized in its expression through what's called a semi-deific form, or a human being's form, and then the technologies and methodologies that he develops. In other words, he expresses the genius of God in that way. Those things, therefore, create an infinitizing effect. Now, the result is that perfect injustice becomes possible, whereas it hadn't been before, and the usurpations of the guises of virtue and the institutions and roles of authority will be demonstrations of that taking place, and the inversion of their consequences from what they were supposedly intended to what they result in. And it is so perfectly ambivalent to what it should be that it creates a complete divergence from the actual origin that was the basis of its existence. Hence, it destroys itself. You could say ontologically that's the actual nature of this entity. So it has basically cut its own throat, and we're just basically watching it bleed out. That's only prolonged by, I guess, the time it takes to come to some adjustment to this fact and respond accordingly. But this is, of course, what's being suppressed in these days, where perfect injustice takes the form of psychotronics, psychotronically augmented racketeering, which plenty of which I've been discussing. But I'd rather focus now on the covert internet topologies, because the fact that I'm even discussing it over the internet is directly affected by this issue. Is the internet an open topology system that, like it pretends to be, where subversion of the flow of information, where its distortion would be an anomalous condition? No, actually it's not. The evidence is that it was originally set up to be a highly controlled system for the military to conduct communications with itself and with the government and with other entities. So it's meant to be both secure against invasion, in other words, private unto itself, and at the same time in total control of all assets flowing through it, and hence it has an immune system against intrusion. So this is secure against invasion in two ways. One, they can have all the privacy they could ever want, and two, they could detect and even misinform intrusions into that. So this is a weapon system. It's good for propaganda. It's good for intelligence agency warfare against other countries. It's good for all sorts of things, but it's also anything that could be used in war can be used on the public by a tyrant, and so it's being used for that purpose right now. The internet was a system developed in conjunction with corporations who have obviously vested interests, not in our best interest or in our well-being generally, who have concerted together to create a system of espionage and propaganda, which is extremely powerful. And it would have been just as powerful for the benefit of people to communicate freely their ideas if that hadn't been done. Of course, that's from the beginning what had been done. So did they advertise it as being this? No. They opened out with propaganda suggesting it was an open topology system, which it is not. So this being determined means that in most possible worlds where you see evidence of certain other rackets, you will also definitely see evidence of rackets other than those. They have counterpart conditions. And if there is a prior and easier to conduct racket, that will be done first because they will always choose the path of least resistance. Covert internet topologies are far easier to create and hide from the public than are, say, something as outlandish as psychotronics to create. But though that will become easier to hide from the public because it's so outlandish. But this is something that can be understood, and it will be the first thing that will be delivered and rolled out. So that means that anytime you see a version of the internet that you're looking at, you're basically looking at one more or less custom created for you and a certain number of other nodes, greater than or equal to u plus whatever. And that can be developed in a way that will be undetectable by you with a great degree of probability, in that should you gain access to some other node, that'll be information that you had to gain through the clearance provided you by the actual user of that interface. Otherwise, your purchase or your possession of it can be traced, and eventually your nodal connection to the internet can be controlled in the same way as before. They'll just assign it a relationship to every other node through their mainframes and their master servers, which dictates what you see and what you're able to express and who can see what you express. That's always been the way that it has been. The pretense has been that it was basically open topological so that people could move freely as if they were just wandering around the frickin' prairie land or something. That's not how it works. So with that under control, anything you see going on, you have to understand is already part of a controlled system to which you're not privy of the control's existence. You're not even privy to the existence of that control, which is already an information asymmetry that can be used against you. If there's ever any motive for a distortion that you're not aware of, there could be a distortion you're not aware of, and then that could affect you in all sorts of ways, or your movement, or your group, or whatever investment you have in communicating over the internet can be affected. If those can be established with the pretext of national security, then a justification sufficient for most dupes can be put in place to intimidate them to go along with it. So the lower echelons of society will quickly fall into line, being easily duped and easily afraid of death and torture and that sort of thing. Easily flattered by whatever attributes they've been misgiven by nature through the frauds of ages ago in their DNA. Whatever else is the reason for them being the way they are, they're easily duped. And they go along with it because they don't want to think twice about a thing. It's just too hard and it hurts their head too much. So the probability of reaching an audience like that's already great in the worlds we know exist. In worlds where covert internet topologies exist and are enforced, you're going to find that those with an interest in control and the suppression of information will redirect anyone curious about certain information away from anyone else curious about certain information, while maintaining for each the illusion that this is an information transaction clearinghouse that's open to everybody, which is utter bullshit, obviously. Now, for those who don't care, well, they're just flotsam and jetsam on this ocean, on this beach. They could just be used and cast any direction that they want, and they can care less. And they can even be subtly rewarded for being that way. And so there can be an overall stoichiometry of the situation, a term used in chemistry to suggest the proportionalities of things. that are involved in a chemical reaction. So there could be something like that established on a social level. They have equations which describe these possibilities. Equations which describe these possibilities in the abstract, in any setting. Now take a controlled electronic setting. That can easily be established as well. But when it's not in that domain, we're talking about the domain of human action, and that'll be in my next video concerning the activities of physical agents of fifth column and how they go about their business and out in the public. But that's a separate issue. That, however, is the more basic form of what's been going on. But the covert internet topologies directly affect this mode of interaction. Now, face-to-face interaction would be affected in a similar way, but through direct action of fifth column, which I'll discuss in the next video. And then finally, to augment the totality of this and other rackets is the psychotronics control grid, which is what I call it. And we'll get into that thirdly. You note that I don't take each example and put it through the ringer. I tell you generally what can be done with topologies. You can reason out the implications on your own. Let's say that for advertising alone, it's demonstrated with the different search engines and their preferences that they decide that you have, and then they present to you. Sometimes they can decide wrongly and decide things that you would consider perverse for you or out of line. But that's all part of that same weapon system. They can do it to customize your interaction with things that you might want or things you might not want, even to see. So these topologies are already known to exist by people. They just don't understand that it's not just these search engines. It's the very structure of the internet, which was a military intelligence weapon system and defense methodology as well, because they could communicate information faster and therefore have an excuse for acting on behalf of the nation through this weapon system. And this weapon system is also to not only secure information, but provide disinformation to anyone who can intrude in it. Their intrusions are supposed to be detectable. That's cyber warfare. So all this already existed. This is not actually new. And fifth columnary was around long before that. So fifth columnary is the ancient racket that I'm talking about. Covert internet topologies is just the less esoteric of the two I'm going to talk about. Besides it. And after fifth columnary, which is like the bread that everybody can understand, this other exotic flesh that's going to be on the other side, made out of pure demon meat, is called the psychotronics control grid. And most of the people involved in everything up to that point don't even know about the psychotronics control grid, because that's a very high value weapon system, and it would be denied knowledge of existence to most people, period. But it's the fact that there have been representations of its existence since the mid-1800s, right when electrodynamic principles were being discovered by the foundational scientists in those subjects of physics, is also not a coincidence. And the fact that these types of energy rays or directed energy weapon systems do exist is simply a matter of fact. Anyone can find the patents on them if they would even bother to even do a basic search. So the fact that people are apathetic toward these conditions can be an important factor derived from more than just chemical or biological warfare, but also from psychotronics warfare, which is far more powerful as a force multiplier, once it's attuned properly. Otherwise, it just causes certain forms of damage, which lead to the death of the subject, rather than the mind-altering, life-altering features, which they need in order to compromise an individual without necessarily killing them, because it's often more useful to keep an enemy subject alive if, say, you could say pass on some disease into this subject, and he goes back to his camp and he takes that disease as a vector into his camp and wipes out his whole camp. These kind of things are that's just common sense that could be possible. So often death is mostly a threat or a last-ditch possibility when they lose control in ways they can't recuperate from. And as in chess, the execution is not often as strong as the threat. So they want to build on what they've already got. Like they've got a certain amount of chips. They want to buy out their opponents. They want to increase their influence over the game. And this is how they continue to operate. They have the horde of technology, which I'm talking about, and they're developing it in parallel and separate from what's offered to the public. By the time it's offered to the public, it's already weaponized against them behind the scenes for a long time. And then what's packaged for them is presented as something beneficial to them, but there are already backdoors built into that hardware too, just like with the internet. So they're just going into more and more seamless forms of being controlled without knowing it. And all the propaganda being dished out through these paid mouthpieces in these different weaponized cultural sectors are also contributing to this drift into spiritual oblivion. But they're guilty of being dupes to the extent that they've succumbed to that without paying attention and due diligence to the evidence and using common sense and logic appropriately. So that's sort of the fruit of their labors, right? Everybody's going to eat the bread that they sweat to create. That's how that's going to operate. But whenever it becomes impactful on others asymmetrically in ways inappropriate to people's roles and the way the culture espouses these relations and roles, that's when it starts to become a deeper and deeper and more perfect form of injustice. And that sort of racket has to be addressed directly. So I've addressed one of the factors that complicate and exacerbate this condition, and that is covert internet topologies. On the next one, because it's been cropping up in my immediate vicinity quite a lot, which I'll be able to get into this very day, I'll be talking about the techniques of fifth column ring using human intelligence.